Welcome to Ask the Therapist, a monthly podcast for everyone who's interested in how our minds work, building resilience through journaling and all things therapy. I'm your host, Sarah Rees, a mental health nurse and CBT therapist with over 20 years of experience in the field of mental health. Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Ask the Therapist. And it's the podcast's third birthday, so happy birthday podcast. I have been celebrating this last month by sharing some clips of my previous guests answering one of my favourite questions, which is, what would you say to your 15-year-old self? What would you say to your 15-year-old self? I'd love to know. So if you head over to my Instagram account, sarahdrees.co.uk, in the highlights section for the podcast, if you have a look in there, there's some templates where we've got the question and there's a space underneath for you to give your answer. And you can then share it on Instagram or send me a DM using the hashtag AskTheTherapist and I'll be sure to find it. And you can find the clips of my previous guests answering the question in the Reels section, and I've scattered some in the grid as well. They've been really fun to listen back to. And this episode is a real birthday treat. I have the honour and the privilege to interview one of the most amazing people and minds that I know, Professor Paul Gilbert OBE. I had the honour of training on his course over at Derby University in 2016, and it really had a huge impact on me professionally and personally, and has really changed how I deliver therapy and changed a lot about how I live my life and some of the practices I have every day as well. Professor Paul Gilbert is founder of Compassion Focused Therapy and Compassionate Mind Training. He's also one of the founders of the Compassionate Mind Foundation, which is a brilliant website. It's got all the training on there and some resources. It's well worth going to have a look. He's author of a number of books, to name a few: The Compassionate Mind, Living Like Crazy, Distinctive Features for Compassion Focused Therapy, Psychotherapy and Counselling for Depression, Overcoming Depression, and a book that I recommend time and time again to people, and it's what I often go back to, which is called Mindful Compassion. This was co-authored with Choden. He's also written a number of journal papers and research papers, and he has a latest book out, which is Compassion Focused Therapy, Clinical Practice and Applications. And that is on its way to me via Amazon as we speak. So I can't wait to get my hands on that. I thoroughly enjoyed interviewing Paul today. He gives some really useful insights. He's really fun to interview and his knowledge is just amazing, as you can expect. And I know you're going to get a lot from it. So sit back, grab a coffee and enjoy the episode. And if you have any feedback for us or any questions, do drop me an email at inquiries@sarahdrees.co.uk, or you can DM me over at Instagram and I will be sharing any feedback with Paul. I hope you enjoy. Firstly, thank you very much for joining me today on Ask the Therapist. It's lovely to have you here. I've been meaning to ask you for a long time, just building up the courage myself. So one of the first questions I often ask my guests, and something I'm really curious about, because I think it's kind of quite a strange job that we do as therapists, but is how you became a therapist. I'm curious to know how that developed. I've been reading some of your work over the last few weeks, kind of getting a refresh, and then I read, I hope I've got this right, that you did an economics degree initially and you've had some dreams about being a guitarist. I can see a guitar in the background, maybe in a rock band. And then, so I'm curious how that went to psychology and becoming a therapist.
Well, firstly, Sarah, thank you very much for inviting me onto your brilliant podcast, which you do. And also I know that you've done training in CFT and promoted that brilliantly. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to come and talk to you. So it's lovely to meet up again as well. So how did I become? Well, interestingly, when I was young, I always had this sort of interest in people and was quite a person kind of person. And then in the 60s, when I was doing my A-levels, psychology really wasn't much of a discipline, and I was studying economics at A-level and planning to, go into business or whatever and make a bit of money, as you do. as a young person. And I did think about psychology, but all my tutors said, "Oh no, you don't want to do that. You'd be much better off doing, doing your basic economics degree." So that's what I did. But while I was doing that, I was always sort of had an eye on the psychology course, and I read this book by Colin Wilson called "The Further Reaches of Human Nature."
No, wow.
Just taken by it, really, and I thought I wanted to do that. So anyway, I thought, well, what should I do? So I knew there were a couple of places in the country that did what was called changeover degrees, where they would take somebody from a non-psychology background and train them up in psychology. And also I was beginning to think about clinical psychology, but to begin with, I wasn't. I was just thinking maybe social or something like that. So I got my degree and I applied to Aston, which had a sort of a combined psychology and economics. But Sussex, which is the one I wanted to do, was much more basic science with brain studies and all kinds of stuff. The funny thing was, I got rejected.
Oh my gosh, I bet they're kicking themselves now.
I was rejected. But and my parents in those days, because this is 73 by now, my parents in those days were in Dubai. So I flew out to Dubai for a holiday after my degree. I finished my degree, and that was great. And then I think it was about mid-August, I got this phone call to say, look, somebody's dropped out for the course and you're on the waiting list. Do you want to come for an interview? So my father arranged for me to fly back quite quickly. So I flew back to Sussex and had an interview, and they accepted me on the course. So I did the Sussex MSc, and subsequently I discovered that Stuart Sutherland, who was he had a manic depression problem that he's written about, not secret, was told that one of the people had dropped out from the MSc, and here was the list of individuals to choose from, and he just said, "Oh, I don't know, we'll have him."
Wow, gosh.
So, isn't that amazing? That's the story. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's a nice story, isn't it? So anyway, there we were. And but actually, I failed my neurophysiology paper pretty well in the other papers, but not in the neurophysiology. So I had to stay on at Sussex for a year. This is the changeover degree of Sussex MSc in psychology. So I had to pay for myself. So I went and worked as a psychiatric nurse, did night duty in Brighton, and that was quite interesting because Brighton was an interesting place in those days because all the people would come down from London, take drugs, and go crazy on the beach.
Oh God!
And spend the weekend in our hotel. But it was very, very interesting, and so I learned quite a lot. And because it was night duty, you would sit around and talk to the clients all the time, and so that was great, really, for me. So then I did manage to I did a lot of neurophysiology because I had to pass my
it's to do it again.
As you do. And then applied and originally went to Birmingham, but that didn't work out, and transferred to Edinburgh with Ivy Blackburn. And Ivy Blackburn, of course, was doing the first cognitive therapy trial in Great Britain. And so PhD student. And the rest, as they say, is history, which I can talk about if you're interested. But that was the story. And then I went to Edinburgh and did a PhD on depression.
Wow. And what's driven you in your career? We were just talking a little bit beforehand, and your retirement doesn't sound very much like retirement. You've worked hard, you've done so much. What's been the driving force for it all?
I think there's a lot of things, isn't it, really? About it's to do with personality, about it's to do with fascination, partly it's to do with narcissistic self-promotion. Different things, I guess. But I think that one of the interesting things is that in economics, you're taught right from day one, you have to learn how things interact, right? You have to build models of economies and so on. So when I came to psychology, we can't do that. No, it's too complicated. You're going to do a course on learning, and a course on psycholinguistics, and a course on social psychology. But how does it actually work? And how does the brain? Oh, I don't know. It's too complicated. You can't do that. So I was always interested in model building. Was very interested in model building and trying to get a picture of actually how things work and fit together. And Sussex was very much into classical conditioning, so that's always stayed with me. The importance of the body. The body keeps the score. That's and stuff. So I've been very interested in body work. So what drives me is just absolute fascination with with that and with how the mind works, really.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And thinking about, and this might take you back to the other point, is that lots of CBT therapists find the way to compassion-focused therapy. I know when I did my training in CBT, I then went, I was working in a very deprived area of Manchester, where I'd trained for 18 months. I did the IAPT course. It's quite intensive. And the clients that I worked with had been really handpicked. So they just had panic disorder. I don't know how they found them. And then just, very fit all the models. And then when I was let out into the real world, it didn't look like the models and the books and how I've been taught. And that's probably how I found my way into compassion focused therapy. But I'm interested in what's your take on why so many CBT therapists kind of find the way to CFT?
Well, CBT is a bit of a sad story in a way, because we learned with Tim Beck and stuff like that, and he tells an interesting story that he was doing a demonstration behind a one-way screen, and they had people from all over America come to watch him do demonstrations, and they had these group watching him do a demonstration. And he did this really nice piece of work, which he thought it was a nice piece of work, and he helped clients identify some of their automatic thoughts and how that was linked to various underlying beliefs, and how these beliefs had been rooted in their history and everything. And so he thought, oh, that's great. So he came out from around out of the zoo, and he looked at these people, and they all looked at him blank. And they said, well, what's that we just watched? And he said, well, that's cognitive therapy. And they said, no, but it's counseling. So he taught us right at the beginning, which has been lost, I think, personally, in that actually getting to know your client was really crucial, and that CBT assumes you have good counseling skills. It assumes that you're good at that kind of stuff, and then beginning to use Socratic questions, guided discovery within that context. But it's sort of moved on a little bit like that, and it's become a bit more like a factory, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't part of my training. I'd done, my background's in mental health nursing, and I'd done counselling training and came into it. But that was just a fluke that I'd done that counselling training. I wouldn't have been given it.
But it is really the foundation, I think. So when people first come across CFT, what they discover actually is some basic counselling stuff again, of actually slowing down, taking an interest. What guided discovery actually is about understanding people and helping them begin to understand themselves and so on. And that takes time. This trying to push people through in 6 sessions. And Tim was actually never really, was always ambivalent about manuals and that kind of stuff. There's a wonderful, can't remember the title of it now, but it's in my new book, interview with him about 5 years ago, and some of his reflections on and how.
I'd love to.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So I think CBT is this rapid turnover. I mean, you can understand it because people are wanting to get access to some kind of psychological help.
Yes.
The epidemiology, if you think 10% of your population, and it's more than that really, have psychological problems. Well, in 1 million people, you've got 100,000 people, right? So it's huge.
Big problem.
So you can understand the push for it, but I think the problem is that, as you say, in the real world, people have got complex, multiple problems, and it just takes time. Therapy takes time. That's the thing. So that, I think people like. So they like this slowing down aspect of it. They like the more counseling side to it. They like the focus on motivation rather than just the strength of your belief. Actually, the motivation, the ability to genuinely feel a compassion, motivation, the desire to be helpful, the recognition that also depends upon a certain kind of physiological ability, vagus nerve and all that. So they begin to get into that feel about motivational change, motivational switching has to underpin cognitive switching, and people kind of like that.
Yeah, I think the neuroscience as well, and helping people understand the brain has been, something was really transformative, helping people see they have really tricky brains and stuff.
I mean, I think that's very important. I don't think it was ever meant, but the think good, feel good sort of Americanization, well, Tim was American, obviously, but that sort of hype stuff hasn't done CBT any favors at all, because Tim was much more nuanced than that. I mean, he had an evolutionary view and so on. So, yeah, so the idea is just get people to think differently and they would change. That was never really his view. His view was that if you help people understand how their thinking contributes to their distress, and they can stem. So it was much more softer than what we sometimes hear now. But CBT is extremely useful. I mean, it's a very, very useful sort of, if you really use guided discovery, Socratic question, behavioral experiments, as they were designed to be used, they can be incredibly helpful to people.
What was Aaron Beck like? Had you met him a number of times?
Yeah, he was always very kind to me. He wrote a very lovely, just reissued it actually, my depression book. Sorry for the public.
No, I have seen that. I will link it in the show notes, don't you worry.
He just reissued the 84 depression book, and on the back he wrote a very lovely endorsement. So he was always extremely good and supportive for me. We had lots of discussions about evolutionary approaches, and he uses evolutionary approaches quite a lot, although people don't always realize that.
Yeah. Well, I'll be interested to go back to that and have a reread. In kind of as we kind of develop as therapists, you kind of you're just forever learning, aren't you? The courses and the training and the development doesn't end. And one of the things that has come up a lot for me and people I supervise is that as we grow and get new knowledge and maybe learn more about compassion focused therapy, we kind of look back over the clients that we worked with and think, oh God, I wish I'd known that then, and feel like we've really done people a disservice. What would you advise therapists around that?
I think I saw that question. That was a wonderful question. So the first thing is actually that view, isn't it? That's fantastic, isn't it? I wish I'd known that then, because then I could have been more helpful. But that is the way it always has to be. It can never be any different to that, right?
No.
And when I was training, because I was lucky after I'd done my PhD, and obviously I went on and did group psychodynamic training for a few years, and I worked for 5 years in a Jungian day hospital. There's a lot of Jungian training. So I'd only been qualified about 6 months, working on the acute unit, and the people there were really quite tricky, abuse and all kinds of things. So I went to my supervisor, who was a lovely woman. She was an analyst, really. We used to smoke a lot in those days. And I said, look, these clients on this inpatient unit, they're really struggling, and I'm finding qualified. I don't know what the hell I'm doing half the time. There must be somebody else they can see, somebody that's got more experience than me, because these are really quite severe, they're suicide and goodness knows what. And she looked at me and said, well, there's only 2 of us. I said, yeah, but there must be somebody else, surely. She said, well, look, I suppose you could think about it. I said, we'd probably all do a lot better if we had Sigmund Freud. But the problem is there is only you. There is no one else, right? And the thing is, all you can do is to be the best 6-month qualified therapist you can be. And for sure, in 20 years, you'll probably know more and be better. But you can't have it today. And that is one of the lessons of being a therapist, is actually don't get caught up in narcissistic over-identification or feeling you should know, be more, have more, do more. That is a trap you do not want to catch. Okay, and in 20 years, you'll look back and this is what she said, you'll look back and you'll think, oh my goodness, if only I'd known that.
Yeah.
And hopefully you do, because if you don't do that, then you haven't moved. You haven't improved.
That is very true.
The next part of the question, however, but the idea is that that's a good thing to be doing that.
Yes,
to realize how much more you know now and how you are better now, and in another 10 years you'll do the same thing again. But then you're doing clients a disservice. Well, that's then can become a source of guilt or disappointment or upset. And that you do need to be careful about, because then you get into self-criticism and all kinds of stuff, which is not helpful at all. So not to think you've done them a disservice, but always think that at the time you try to help them the best way you could. And yes, now you might have other techniques. Therapies have moved on. The science has moved on. We've all learned more. I've learned a lot more from, all kinds of people, Steve August and all the others. But it takes time.
I think that's really useful. And one of the reasons I asked that is because I remember you teaching it on the course and it being really so useful for me. And actually, sometimes when I find myself going into that kind of self-doubt and stuff, really just working a lot more on me so I can be the best I can be in that moment.
I mean, you know, as you know, we've talked about this on the course, you know, I've lost people to suicide, and you look back, I made a mistake there, I should have done that. Let's just do the best we can. Make sure that obviously you do all your risk assessments and all the right things. Of course, that's correct. But if you're going to work very seriously, people who've got major mental health difficulties, they are risky, and you do everything you can, but occasionally over a 40-year life, you will sadly lose people. And your ability to cope with that is very important, and not to start, you know, bashing yourself on the head, because that's a disservice to them as well.
Yes.
If only then I could have saved you. Me. It's not like that, you know. It's the ability to grieve for the pain that person was in. That's the most important thing.
Right? I think that leads us lovely on my next question, which is hopefully not too tricky for you, which is why compassion? Can you tell us about why it's so important that we develop compassion with our clients and for ourselves, I think?
Well, it's a really interesting story, because if you're wanting the more personal side to it, which I think you do, a couple of things really. You obviously know the story, because I've told this so many times, how we started all this stuff with doing CBT, which I still do a lot of CBT, but do it in a different way than I used to do. So this was a lady who'd had a very difficult background of being adopted and into a difficult family, and thought she shouldn't have been born and all that stuff. But she'd made quite a good relationship with her. She had a good relationship with her husband and kids and all that. So you could do the cognitive stuff. And she'd been in and out of hospital, a lot of suicide attempts. And the psychiatrist said, I don't know what we can do, but see what you can do. So and she used to play me up. I said, oh, I can't, you know, I know you're trying to help me, but I can't. I've got to kill myself. So we'd have to phone up GP. And so it was quite tricky. But so one day then we were doing this cognitive stuff of actually looking at some of the thoughts that preoccupied her. I shouldn't have been born. I'm not really wanted. I'm just a fake. You know, people say they love me, but I think that's only because all that was tough. And we got her to be able to say, well, but you know, if you stand back from that, you know, could you see that your husband has behaved in a way that shows that he loves you and so on? So we could do all of that sort of checking out what's the evidence for it. She said, yes, I can see it really, I suppose, but it doesn't make any difference. And so I said to her, well, okay, I don't know why I said this to her. It was one of those things where, what am I going to do now? I don't know what to do. So I said to her, how do you hear them in your mind? You know, how do you hear those coping thoughts when you really think to yourself, well, actually, you know, my husband stood by me and he does care about me and he is worried about me and so on and so on. How do you hear them in your mind? And she said, what do you mean, how I actually hear them? And I said, yeah, speak them out. Tell me how you speak them out as you actually hear me. She was a little bit embarrassed, but she said, okay, come on, you're doing cognitive therapy, aren't you? You got a husband who loves you. You got 3 lovely children. Is that how you hear them? She said, yes, I'm doing cognitive therapy. I know. I've got to make myself believe this.
Oh, God.
You've seen this video, haven't you? Oh my goodness. I thought, no wonder you're not going to. So I said, well, what would happen if you kind of keep the same information in your coping thoughts, but you change the tone, you know? Let's imagine a part of you that's really compassionate and wants to support you, understands how depressed you've been and what a struggle that's been for you, and is genuinely interested in helping you. What would happen if you created that kind of tone in your mind? And she said, I'm not doing that. Why would I want to do that? That's pathetic. I've never been kind to myself. I can't see how. I don't deserve it anyway, but how on earth would that help me? I've just got to make myself believe this stuff. So that was the second shot. The first shot was really the real hostility was being carried in the emotion, not in the content. The second shot was this real resistance. They didn't want to do it. And the third shot was when we did start to do it, oh boy, it really opened up a big issue of trauma in the caring system, because in any emotional system, be it a sexual system or a caring system or an assertive system, if you've got a lot of trauma in that system, the moment you start to trigger it, it comes. So the problem with compassion is that when you start compassion as a therapy, you don't get into, oh, let's be kind to myself. Isn't this wonderful? Isn't this nice? You don't get that. You get grief, you get rage, you get doubt, you get fear, all the stuff that's coded in that. You know, if you've been abused or neglected, that's all coded in your attachment system, right? That's where it is. And so that was the third shock, really. And so CFT really became partly a way of detoxifying the attachment system, so that people could begin to generate a more compassionate tone to themselves, a more helpful motivation to themselves than just trying to force themselves. I don't know. I'll give you one more example. Which this good. This lady. So when people are very depressed, you want to get them out of bed, because otherwise they lay there ruminating. So you get them out of bed, do some stretches, a bit of yoga, have a cup of tea. Stretching is quite important. The movement is quite important. So we've known that for a long time. So there we are. So we had a little note that she put on the side of her bed that when she woke up, to get out of bed, do these stretches, and make a cup of tea. These were her products, okay. So anyway, great. So she comes back the next week. How did you get on? She said, yes, I remember when I was in bed and I saw the note. I made myself get up. So I said, well, what went through your mind? She said, yes, I saw the note. And I said, come on, get out of bed, you fucking lazy bastard. I thought, hang on a minute. Where did that come from?
Oh, gosh.
Where did that come from? Well, you know, that's the truth, isn't it? That's the truth. Get out of bed, do some stretches. So what became very interesting, is this hostility was sort of underneath. It was in the emotional motivational system. It wasn't really so much in the cognitive system, and therefore you had to work with that. And that was really, really interesting. So that's CFT started to try to produce textures for these individuals. And then, of course, all the stuff about
and what I find really interesting is that lots of people, until you ask those questions, don't have awareness of mind. They don't know how they're talking to themselves, do they? But I do remember learning about self-criticism and then thinking, oh, I don't do that, I'm okay. And then it caught up with me and I was like, oh my God, I need to work on this. So it's awareness of mind, isn't it?
It's absolutely brilliant point you made, Sarah. Yeah, it's mind awareness. And you tune, that's what guided discovery is, in a way. You tune people into that, and they're often not aware of the hostility of their criticism. I think criticism is okay and it's going to help them, but actually the hostility in the criticism is pretty awful.
Yeah, really detrimental to our mental and physical well-being, isn't it? Hugely.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Do you think there are questions that we are not asking in therapy? So if you could, if you think about therapists, are there questions that you think we should all be asking a little bit more of, or are there questions that we avoid because we're worried?
Yeah, I think it's if you want to do the CFTP, you'd always find where is the caring motivational system, where is the threat systems. Those two, you're always interested in those two. So what is your greatest fear of? Could be of change, of being compassionate, of giving up self-criticism, or blah, 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 blah. So the first thing is always find out what the threat system is up to. And the second thing is, where is the support system, the caring system, the system that kind of picks you up? Because self-criticism will kick you, whereas your compassion will pick you up and support you and guide you and carry you a bit. So find out how easy is it for them to be caring? How easy is it for them to generate genuine compassion motivation? If you've had somebody who's abused, right, and is feeling very bad with themselves or guilty, whatever it is, how easy is it for them to take a genuine compassion orientation to their experience of abuse? And what you find, of course, is for a lot of people, they can't do it. So they're trying to do exposure, whatever it is, but actually there's no system of caring or support to hold it. So those and for non-CFT therapists, what you find is they very rarely do any work on creating a secure base, safe haven, that sort of context that holds and cares and supports and guides and so on.
I know sometimes when I do the model about explaining CFT and I get to the soothing system and I just kind of say what it's about and people just burst into tears.
Yes. I think, yeah, that's a brilliant point you made. Grieving is incredibly important in CFT, the ability to grieve for that inner loneliness and that sense of that you may be carried, or that you're not really lovable, or there's something wrong with you, or whatever. The ability to grieve. And that, again, was a bit of a shock, because when, particularly if you're working with people who have been traumatized, when they start to grieve, I mean, it's whole body, the body just sobs. It's not like a few tears. It's like the body breaks, breaks open, all that pain breaks open. So that also was something that I hadn't actually experienced just doing CBT, of this real deep felt sadness, grieving.
And how did you manage holding that level of emotion?
Well, again, I think I had it because of my counseling background. I was kind of able just to sit there, and I mean, as you know, with the client that we show in the training, this went on for some weeks, and you just need to be present. It's called being present to them. So they are having an experience, which in attachment theory, you're providing, in a sense, a secure base and safe haven as a container for their journey. So grief is a journey. It's not like a panic attack where you go in and you but grieving is a journey. It's a process of changing a whole range of processes within the caring and within the social relating systems. Really, a whole series of processes are changing. So grief, any kind of grief, it's a process. It has a beginning, stages, and you have to go through it. So it's important to help therapists realize that it's not like trying to change a panic attack. It's a very different process. And it's just learning to be there and to be able to tolerate it without. I think the other thing that you sort of indicated in a way is, don't put pressure on yourself to make the client experience or do something, right? You guide them, of course you do. That's what guided discovery is. But don't put pressure on yourself that you've got to move this along, you've got to make this happen, you've got to make that happen, you've got to stop them crying, you've got to blah, blah, blah. Things unfold in the way that they unfold, and that's...
It's holding, it's part of the journey that you go on together.
Yep.
Yeah, and lots of people listening to this will be interested in therapy. I think we've been really selling it to people, haven't we? If somebody was listening to this, interested in maybe having their own therapy, what would you want them to know? What would you kind of advise them to do to get started or to be able to engage in the process?
Of course, the great difficulty with it is, of course, there's not that many trained therapists like you. I mean, you're a well-trained therapist and so on, but there's not that many of your gems like you around.
It's growing, though. It's growing.
It is growing, and we are training more people, and it is growing. I mean, the usual things, I'm afraid, is to check out with your GP. But also on the Compassionate Mind website, we now have a register. Now, we're not endorsing therapists because we can't do that. But therapists who've done some training and want to make it known that they will try and provide compassion-type therapists, there is a register on the Compassionate Mind website. And as you say, it's growing. It's but we don't, at the moment, regulate it in terms of accrediting that at the moment because we're just too small.
Yeah. Okay. And for new therapists starting out, do you have any advice for new therapists?
Yeah, look, I would say for new therapists, look, think about it like this. There's something like 300 different schools of therapy, right? Some people put it 400, some people are less, but there are wisdoms in all of them because, and really try to start with the fact that we need to understand a little bit about how minds work. That's why CFT is very strongly into the science. We think about how motives work, how emotions work, how things like empathy and reasoning work, all that stuff. So try and think to yourself, well, the first thing is for me to try to understand the mind of the person that's sitting in front of me. So rather than thinking about what school do I need, what set techniques do I need, start with trying to understand that person and helping them to reflect and think about themselves. If you can do nothing else, that would be terrific. And then the next set of skills is really helping people to think about what they might need in order to progress on the journey of change. Now, maybe they will need to learn how to challenge their thoughts. Maybe they will need how to learn to be more compassionate to themselves. Maybe they'll need to learn how to be more assertive, whatever. But you're working with them to thinking about how can we understand you, and how can we think about what would help you on your journey to deal with whatever it is you're wanting to deal with. And only at that point do you then start to refer to whatever school that appeals to you.
So it's good to get that foundation and build on top of that.
Yeah, get the foundation.
And it is a lifetime of training, isn't it, and developing. So yeah. As you look back over your clinical career, what would you say you've learnt most from the people that you've worked with, either clients or colleagues?
That's a wonderful question. Just about everything. I mean, yes, of course, you pick up stuff from the trainings, of course you do, but at the end of the day, if you're open to allow your client to educate you, because every single client will give you something slightly different, just a little texture here, a little texture there.
Yeah,
it's a little bit like if any of you are musicians, it's like playing guitar. You know, you can talk to other guitarists and you say, "Oh yeah. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, can you do that? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, God, I didn't know that." So, you know, and over the years, you just get better with your technique. You play more things. You do blah, blah, blah. So all training is all life is a little bit the same, is that everybody has something to offer you if you are open to it. So that's the first thing, really. And then the next thing is how they affect you. I think one of the things we don't talk enough about therapists is that there's something very odd about us, really. I mean, why do we want to spend ourselves listening to other people's pain, you know, year in, year out? I mean, why don't we go and get a proper job? I mean, it's ridiculous.
It is interesting, isn't it?
It's very interesting. And when I started my psychodynamic training, that is French psychodynamic. That person has very strong French accent. He said, "So how many of you are voyeurs? Are you voyeurs? Anybody in the room? Are you a voyeur?" Like, you know, because we're young and no, not voyeurs. Anybody like to go into their friends' houses and wonder what goes on in the other rooms? No. He said, "Then please don't become a therapist. Because if you have no fascination in the mind of people, you're no good."
Yeah, it is fascination, isn't it? And curiosity. Yeah.
You need this basic curiosity. And your client begins to see they are a source of your interest. They are a source of fascination. They're not just another case coming through. You chuck all the stuff at them. They actually are a unique human being that have a unique story. And it's like you're reading another novel. You know, they're a new person, story, new all kinds of things going on. So that, I think, is very, very important. But, you know, we do hear a lot of awful things. And it's about how you sustain yourself with that. And we find, I'm sure you find this as well, that the therapists that tend to struggle more are the ones that are always trying to achieve something and do something and do something and do something. But those that are just stay with the client and are just fascinated by the client and are on their journey, they're less likely to get burnt out. It's the ones that are always struggling to change, make this happen, make that happen. That's when you get into trouble.
Yes, yeah, and I think that sometimes happens if you work in an IAP service and you can be thrown into that modality, can't you? But it's the stepping back and just being with sometimes hugely important. Yeah.
And I think the key issue is always remembering that for all of us, really, whether it's we think about capitalism or poverty or whatever it is, social systems really cause us a lot of the pains that we feel, actually, you know, and you can be caught up in a system that puts pressure on you. And it's important to realize that the pressure is coming from the system and it's not about you.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Yeah. Do you think it's important that therapists, CFT therapists or all therapists kind of apply it to themselves? Because, you know, like CBT, you don't have to have your own therapy, do you? But I think that's unique. Most therapies, you do have to have your own therapy.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it's recommended, though, in CBT. I mean, James Bennett Levy has written the Inside Out books and so on and so on. It is certainly recommended. You should. have some experience of your own therapy, and certainly should use that as your own guide for life. So it's not very good when I've known this. The CBT therapists wanted their own therapy, so they went and saw a psychedelic therapist because they said, "Oh, I don't want to do CBT." That's quite fun. So the key thing then is, if you can't make your techniques work for you, then what are you doing, right? Helping, if you're doing CBT, then if you're able to see how, paying attention to what you think, being able to stand back, doing guided discovery on yourself, maybe writing some letters to yourself or whatever techniques and they're helpful to you, that will really help you in your therapy. But if you're somebody who doesn't use them yourself, I think therapy then becomes more mechanical. The other thing is that, mindfulness now is really quite an important part of CBT, I think, and you really should have your own personal practice. And in CFT, is, Sarah, we suggest quite strongly you have your own compassion practice, because it does change you.
Yes, yeah. My background was in nursing and then CBT, and so I was kind of always very full on, working long shifts, then do. And when I hit 40, and then I did the CFT training, and then a couple of years later I hit 40 and developed a thyroid condition and then celiac, and like the wheels fell off at 40, and I really had to change how I kind of care for myself and think about my own well-being. And and I wish I'd done it years ago, in terms of applying what I know to myself. It's been, made me a much better therapist. I think my clients say the same, but also I think that my clients can tell when you practice what you're talking about as well, and they'll ask you for your experiences. And when they first start off with mindfulness, which is kind of the foundation of compassion mind training, there's blocks and struggles that regularly come up in that training, and you need to know about them. And people can tell if you've never done it, can't they?
They certainly can, yeah, they certainly can. And I think it's such a good point that you make. And also using self-care to be genuinely self-care, and not just to apply a set of techniques to yourself because you're supposed to do that. That's what they say, I've got to practice it on myself. Because if you don't, it all comes back to motivation, doesn't it? If you don't really have that motivation to genuinely take care of yourself, I mean, it's a very ancient process. You go back in evolution. I mean, even birds, preen themselves and keep themselves clean, don't they? And get rid of all the bugs and all the stuff like that. So self-care, physical self-care, is something all animals have to do.
Yes.
And we just have to self-care for our minds. So we just have to be aware where some of the toxins might have been, or where we're not really feeding the good part, and we're letting the threat system get a bit too heavy or whatever. So it's a very important
I definitely, when I started really applying it to myself, I did it out of fear because I wasn't well, and everything else didn't work, and I thought, oh God, now I really have to apply this mindful stuff. So I did it out of fear initially, and then had to kind of work on letting go of the fear.
That's right. And I think the key, I mean, I didn't know it would, but the ability to sit down and just imagine a part of you, or a compassion imaging, saying, oh, what a terrible thing you're going through, Sarah. This is so different. So that empathic connection really is the first, a really feeling that you can allow yourself to imagine or be with the fact that this is bad. I'm going through a lot of pain right now. Rather than fighting with it, I mustn't have it. But no, it is bad. But that sense of a compassion to that pain, that empathic connection to the pain, compassion, the empathic connection to, I'm actually really quite frightened right now. And that's a first step, really. Because you're not trying to soothe things away, which is often what people get confused about. Soothing grounds you, but it's not to soothe it away. It's really to give you the courage to hold and to tolerate. That's what it's there to do.
Well, it's the first psychology of compassion, isn't it? That turning towards the struggle.
Turning towards your pain and grounding, containing it, and not trying to soothe it away. It's very important. Yeah, very, very important.
Yeah. And if you think, I'm sure you can, well, I know you've read lots and lots of books, haven't you? But if you could recommend a few books that you think have been really kind of fundamental to and very important that we should all read, what would they be?
Well, therapy books, I suppose a book which really impressed me very when I was a younger therapist was Yolom's book, Existential Psychotherapy. It was 1980, so it's quite old now.
Okay.
But that was really, as a therapy book, I thought that was good. But obviously, then there's, you got Tim Beck's book of 79, the depression book, which is one of the first really major CBT books and so forth. So that's important. Also, there's a book by Jean Knox called Attachment and Archetype, and more recently Martin Graham Music's book on attachment. So I read quite a lot of stuff on the attachment stuff, because I think it's really helps you in terms of clinical process. I mean, it's not terribly technique oriented, but it will help you in terms of, because you can learn your techniques, go to workshops and all the rest of it. But these books, I think you might find quite helpful. So Yolom, I liked Yolom because it talks about the basic human existential issues, death, loneliness, meaning, and so forth. And as I say, I like the Jungian stuff. Jung's a bit difficult to read in the raw, so you have to really read other people about it. But I think you'd enjoy Jean Knox's book.
Okay.
On archetype and attachment, and also Anthony Stevens' book on the nature of the self, which was quite an important book for me when I was younger. The archetype of the self. So those are a couple of books which I think are quite
fantastic. Thank you. And thinking about the direction of therapy and psychology, what do you think we should be looking out for or keeping an eye on? How do you think it's going to develop going forward?
Well, it's very interesting. We are fast approaching a much more biopsychosocial approach. Yeah. So if you think about things like Steve Porges's work or Daniel Siegel's work or Consolenzo's book, he's just brought this book out on the neuroscience of psychotherapy, we are beginning to need to understand what interventions help people to change their brains and their bodies. The whole issue of embodiment now is becoming really, really quite important. And that there's a little bit of evidence coming that if people do not change physiologically, then they either don't change at all or they don't have sustained change. Patrick Steffen in America has done some very interesting work on CFT and shown that if people change, they also have change in heart rate variability. But if they don't change heart rate variability, they don't. The whole issue of neuroplasticity, I think, is very, very interesting. So that's coming, and I don't think we can avoid the body for too much longer, to be honest. I went to a very interesting conference. I think it was on by the Royal Society of Medicine, but I might be wrong about that, but whatever. And they were talking about long COVID and the depression associated with long COVID. And a lot of these individuals have got problems with their immune system. I mean, these viruses really mess up your immune system, and there's a big link between the immune system and depression. So one of the key things is us to begin to understand that depressions are multifactorial. There's many, many paths into depression. Women can get depressed in the menopause, or all kinds of things can trigger it. Psychological therapies can be helpful, but they need to be recognizing that it's not all just about cognitive beliefs or motivation of systems. The mind and the body are very complicated. So I think that is the future coming. And we're also looking at epigenetic changes. Actually, we're doing some studies on epigenetic change in CFT.
Wow. So it's that kind of like feeling and embodying compassion. And yoga, I suppose, will be big. What do you think about nutrition? And, because a lot of serotonin's made in the gut, and we need, to neglect that, don't we?
Yes, very, very important. That's coming as well. And as you say, the gut, there's a big link between the gut and the vagus nerve and various other things. So the kind of bacteria you've got in your gut. Oh, I mean, the thing is, we're beginning to realize just how complex these systems are. I mean, Ed Watkins and Newbold's done a really interesting paper on reviewing psychotherapies, and they're not as good as we think they are. I mean, quite a lot of depressed people don't do that well with these psychological therapies. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because, you're putting people into trials, but some of them have got really tricky backgrounds. Some of them are problems of poverty. Some, all kinds. Some people are on inflammatory diets, and that some people are very sensitive to inflammatory diets. Some people can eat all the pastas they like and never get large, but other people just need to look at a pizza and they sort of put on 3 kilos.
That's me.
So there are all these fascinating individual variations. So we have to think about a biopsychosocial approach, really, that the mind and the body are all one, and how we create these interconnections. So that's why CFT spends a lot of time talking about what are the physiological systems you're trying to hit. Tanya Singh has done some fascinating work looking at empathy training, compassion training, and mindfulness training, and they all stimulate slightly different systems in your brain and body. But so some individuals you're going to really want to be stimulating quite a lot, on training them quite a lot in mindfulness, maybe, but others you might want to do a lot more on empathy training, because if people can do compassion but they can't mentalize, it's a problem, right? So you're going to have to maybe teach them how to mentalize. And when they can mentalize, that has a range of physiological effects as well.
So exciting times.
Extremely exciting times. And we've got to give up all these tribes and this therapy against that therapy. We need a science which allows us to have an integrated understanding of this person. And there was a wonderful paper written by Eisenberg in 1986, the British Journal of Psychiatry. It was called Mindless and Brainless Science.
Oh, right.
And that was very influential on me, and it's a very clever paper because it says that's the problem, that we've got this fragmentation. Everywhere you look in mental health, it's fragmented, whether it's all the hundreds of therapies that are out there, whether it's some individuals who are interested in the body but other people are not. Some people are right at the other end of the spectrum. Everything is biological and nothing's. So, but what we don't need is either of these two sciences, either a mindless science, just it's all to do with body and just giving antidepressants, or a bodiless science.
Yes, yeah, it's bringing it all together, and how unique and tricky every single person is.
Yeah. And that's why what you were saying is so important. Dance and yoga and all of these things, the ability to ground in your body, because one of the most important things, as you know, is learning not to fight with your own mind, not to express what you're experiencing, not to fight with your own what you're feeling and so on, but actually to be able to work with whatever is arising for you.
That's really useful. Thank you. More training ahead of me, I fear. But no, it's exciting. It's all exciting. And the last question I always ask guests is, if you could go back to the 15-year-old version of Paul Gilbert, what would you say to him?
Keep going with your guitar. You would have made a lot more money.
Go to the stage.
I think the point is, when you look through life and you see all the things you worried about and what happened, I mean, some bad things happen, but you realize that most of it was, if you can go back and say, look, you'll have ups and downs, but it'll be like the weather. It's fine. It's just learn from them and pass through, because sometimes you get very desperate about things, don't you? But hindsight is, I think my 15-year-old would say, well, it's all right for you. You're an old bastard now.
What you like?
Hindsight. I don't want to listen to you. So, my 15-year-old self.
I know. So there's telling that to your 15-year-old self, and your 15-year-old self hearing it and embodying it. Not a chance, I wish. So, and if people listening to this want to follow your work, what book do you think people should read first of your work? You've written quite a few books.
I think probably the easiest one to get into, and it's got exercise and everything, is Mindful Compassion, which I wrote with a Buddhist monk. That's probably the easier one.
Yeah, I've been listening to it on Audible. I listened to The Compassionate Mind, but
wow, there you are. You've got it. Yeah, isn't that amazing?
I've got them all.
That's incredible. Sarah, we'll have to send you a copy of the new book, which comes out next week, which is on the compassion focused therapy, which is actually, I've got it here. In fact,
let's have a look.
Yeah, it's really, really big.
Oh wow! Another one. So they're doing Audible. If you're doing books that size, fantastic. We need an Audible.
But it is a reasonable dip-in book. So I wrote the first part of the book, the science, and then we have about 16 other chapters with different authors talking about depression and anxiety and chair work and group work. And
oh, fantastic. And that's out next week?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Good timing.
Yeah. So compassion, it's called Compassion Focused Therapy, Clinical Practice and Applications. It's me and Gregoris Simos.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, we're very pleased. It's 3 years. I mean, it's just
wow.
1 o'clock in the mornings for 3. But it's a labor of love. I've loved writing it. I mean, you read it now and you think, oh no, you should have said that. Oh no, you missed that bit. Oh God, what happened to that point?
That's tough, isn't it? So you're still doing it with all your wisdom.
I'm terrible, yeah. Oh my God, this is a spelling mistake. How did that happen?
Oh God. Thank you so much for this hour we spent together. I've really, really enjoyed it. I could ask you, oh gosh, keep you going for another couple of hours, but thank you so much, Paul. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to Ask the Therapist. For more information about the CBT Journal, visit my website at saradrees.co.uk. You can also sign up to download your free guide to building emotional resilience, delivered straight to your inbox. You will then also receive regular newsletters where I share my blog posts, podcasts, and tips and strategies for better mental health and psychological resilience. Don't forget to review and subscribe to the podcast, and you can also share episodes on social media using the hashtag AskTheTherapist. This episode was written and presented by me, Sarah Rees, and edited by Big Tent Media and produced by Emily Crosby Media.